Welcome to lesson 4. Today's lesson we begin looking at the topic collection of solid waste. So firstly, we want to look at a definition of the collection of solid waste. When we talk about solid waste collection, we are specifically talking about the gathering or the picking up of solid waste of various types that we've looked at already from various sources, because we know that solid waste can be generated at many different sources, such as we looked at before at homes, residential sources. Then we have other municipal sources such as businesses, commercial places, as well as industrial sources of solid waste. We also have solid waste being generated from other types of activities such as agriculture, medical, etc. But this definition also includes not only the gathering or picking up of the solid waste, but the hauling, or in other words, the transportation of these wastes from the location where it was generated, using collection vehicles that would transport it to another location where it would be emptied. So let us look now specifically at municipal collection services. That if you recall, we would have looked at municipal definition before. That would again include that your urbanized areas where you would have a lot of your commercial activities as well as residential areas. So typically you find that the waste generated in municipal areas would tend to be what we call unseparated or commingled waste. So when we're looking at the collection of this commingled waste, bear in mind that you're talking about all those various types of waste that would normally be generated in municipal environments. They tend to be unseparated, mingled together, and therefore, remember previously when we talked about the fact that some types of waste, such as organic waste, they would tend to decompose and form things like water, carbon dioxide, etc. And when this mingles with things like paper and cardboard and other types of waste that can actually be considered for recycling, you now have a problem, right? But this is what we call commingled waste. And typically in municipal areas, low-rise detached dwellings, such as the traditional flat or two-story house that many of us would live in, we're collecting waste from these sources. Collection services would be targeted at the following areas: curb, which we looked at briefly before. That is the that would be the street collection just outside of your house. Then you have alleyways where collection can be carried out as well. We also have a process or collection service that we call set out set back. We would look at that briefly. And then there is also set out. So the curb collection, as I mentioned before, what is this? Curb collection, this is where the homeowner is responsible for placing the containers to be emptied at the curb on collection day, and they are also responsible for returning the empty containers to the storage location, wherever that may be. Maybe they may have been storing their garbage containers in the garage, in the backyard, in the kitchen, etc. And it will be stored there until the next collection day, when the owner would take it back out to the curb. Most of us are familiar with this. Then you have the alley collection. The alley collection, this is where alleys are part of the city layout. Not every city has alleys, and alleys tend to be very narrow, those narrow spaces between buildings. A lot of older cities tend to have these. They may be in residential areas, commercial areas, and a lot of waste storage would occur in these alleys, where you would tend to find like dumpsters, for example, just as we see in the photograph to the right. The picture to the top gives us an indication of what curbside collection would look like. So you see the truck and the helpers, and you see the bins that would have been put on the sidewalk there ready for collection. Now we're going to look briefly at set out, setback, and set out. So we have a lot of information here, so I'm just going to take you through this quickly. So we looked at curbside and alley collection already, so I'll just briefly recap here for you. So this is where the residents place the containers to be emptied at the curb or in the alley on collection day. You have the collection crews that empty the containers, and the residents are responsible for returning the containers to the original location. What are the advantages of this collection system? The crews can move very quickly. They do not have to enter private property, so the owners don't have to be concerned of having to make complaints about trespassing if there are fewer accidents taking place. This is also less costly than backyard collection. Backyard collection meaning that the collection services crew will actually have to come onto your property and go into your backyard in order to collect the waste. So this is less costly because they need fewer crew members, and it's also adaptable to automated and semi-automated collection equipment. So automated, as we will see later on in the lesson, that would be an example of where you have the garbage trucks. They will have automated arms where they can attach to the containers and lift them and empty them into the truck's tray without too much human effort needed. Disadvantages: on collection days you have waste containers that are visible from the street, so it's as far as aesthetics is concerned, it's a little messy looking on the collection day itself. You have to work according to collection day schedules. Residents are responsible for returning the containers to the proper collection point. So in other words, it's a disadvantage in the sense that residents have a responsibility here. Now let's look at the backyard set out setback collection. This is defined as where containers are carried from your backyard to the curb by a special crew. So the crew is responsible for this now, and they empty the container, right? So they collect the container and they empty it. The special crew then takes the containers back to their original location, so they have a little more responsibility than the previous curbside and alley collection that we just looked at. Advantages: collection days are not needed to be scheduled because the residents are not really they don't really have a responsibility here. Waste containers are not usually visible from the street, so the aesthetics are better, and the use of additional crew members reduces loading time as compared to the backyard carry method. Disadvantages: because crews enter private property, there's more risk of injuries and of course trespassing complaints. The method is more time consuming because they have to go further distances. They have to go onto each property's backyard to collect and return. Residents are not involved, and it requires more crew members than the curbside alley collection, and of course this is more costly because additional crews are required. So this in essence actually summarizes those four collection methods for us. Set out is very similar to set out setback, except that the collection crews are not responsible for setback. The residents in the community, they would be responsible for setback. So still talking about municipal collection services, again we have all types of residential communities. We have from the low-rise to medium-rise apartments as well, not only the single-rise dwellings. And in instances like that, you find that curbside collection is most common. Typically, maintenance staff is responsible for the transporting of containers to the street for curbside collection. Sometimes you find that they would have larger containers that would be used, where individual containers are emptied mechanically using collection vehicles. So if it's a lot of waste in the apartment that's being collected, they would collect in larger containers, and then the larger containers would be transported by the maintenance staff to the curb, where it would be collected by the garbage collection vehicles. As mentioned here, it could be mechanically done, where the trucks would have these attachments that can be attached to the container, lift, empty, and then replace. High-rise apartments, similarly, of course, because it's high-rise apartments, you have larger numbers of residents. Typically, you find a larger volume of waste, so you will need large containers to collect the waste. So depending on the size and the type of the container used, the containers may be emptied mechanically as well, using the collection vehicles as mentioned, as described before. So for example, many of you may be familiar with, you may have experience being in a high-rise apartment building, or maybe any other kind of high-rise building, and one of the ways in which they handle the collection of their waste, there may be a large container or a dumpster of some kind located maybe in a garage or some lower floor, and then you will have chutes from the higher floor that you can put your garbage through, and it will go directly into that bin, which would then be transported to a more convenient collection point for the collection vehicles. So when I talk about mechanical, this is an example of what I'm talking about. Here you have the truck, you have the mechanical arms that would be fitted to attach to the container. The container would be lifted, emptied into the truck, and replaced and detached. For commercial and industrial facilities, both manual and mechanical means are used to collect waste. We're going to look briefly at the difference between the two, but we've already touched on mechanical, so you have a sense of what that is, and many of you have already seen it. To avoid traffic congestion, solid waste in many larger cities are collected late evening and early morning hours. So this is when we assume that there is a minimum of traffic on the road to allow the discomfort of the traffic, of the collection vehicles, not only in terms of the odors and the unsightliness, but also the problems that they would normally cause by blocking traffic. But we know, many of us here know in Trinidad, we have a little problem where that is concerned, because our rush hour and traffic peak hours seem to be from very early until very late all day. Alright, but typically this is what is done. So where manual collection is used, the waste are put into plastic bags. So this is what we are would be accustomed to in a home, but what I'm saying is even in the commercial and industrial facilities it can work like this as well. Think of a restaurant, for example, or a mall. So the waste are put into plastic bags, cardboard boxes, and other disposable containers, which are then placed at the curb for collection. So if space for storing containers is available, a larger movable container may be used. For example, again, think of the mall. They would put a large container at the back in a car park somewhere, and all the garbage from the various establishments would be accumulated there. Some of these larger containers may be outfitted with a compactor section. So when you put in the waste is automatically being compacted, so that when it is collected by the collection vehicle, the volume has already been reduced. So I want to look now briefly at two major categories or types of collection system. The first one we're going to look at is the whole container system, which is HCS, or stationary container system, which is SCS. So where you see those letters, you'll know exactly what it is. So the whole container system These are collection systems in which the containers used for the storage of waste, they are hauled. In other words, they are carried somewhere else, such as to the processing facility. These processing facilities may be, for example, materials recovery facilities. We saw that briefly in a previous lesson. It may be a transfer station, which would be like an intermediate storage point between the source of generation and the final disposal point, or it may be the final disposal site, such as a landfill. So again, the whole container system, the containers are collected and they are hauled to another location. They are then emptied and returned either to their original location or some other location. So here we have a little schematic to help us visualize what we're really talking about. So here, this location, the circles represent a location, and the black rectangles represent a full container, and the hollow represents an empty container. So this circle represents a location, container 1 location, container 2, 3, etc. This location here, this circle here, represents one of the disposal points, in this case transfer station, processing station, landfill site, etc. So let's see how this works. So a truck is disposed to collection point 1, where he will collect a full container. The full container is then transported to the disposal site. Then he continues back from here, from the disposal site, and travels to collection point 2 to collect a full container which is emptied. Then he goes back here, goes to the next location, collects a full one, transports as empty. So remember, the reason we're going back here is to replace it. So we go back to location 3, replace the empty container, go to the next location, pick up a full one, transport it to the disposal site, and we return to the original position to replace the empty container. So this is what the whole container collection system looks like. What are the advantages? The HCS are ideally suited for the removal of waste from sources where the rate of generation is high. So they're producing the waste very fast and in large volumes. So they need large containers. The use of the large containers reduces handling time, as well as unsightly accumulations and unsanitary conditions associated with the use of many smaller containers. HCS is flexible. You could use various types of the various sizes and shapes of collection containers. But there are also disadvantages. So you have containers in the system, they have to be filled manually. So again, if you can imagine a mall, each of the stores, they are responsible for taking their garbage out to the larger container to fill the container. This might take place over the course of a few days or a week, depending on how fast the container is filled before collection is carried out. So thus the use of large containers often lead to low volume utilization at times, unless they have loading aids such as platforms, ramps, and garbage chutes. Well, we mentioned the garbage chutes before. Platforms and ramps may be needed. For example, these containers sometimes can be very large and very high, so loading might be a little inconvenient. So this brings us to the end of the first part of today's lesson. Would you kindly proceed to part 2 of the lesson video for part 2 for this week? Thank you.